The clock had just struck 2 in the morning, and Officer Raj Kumar was fighting off the drowsiness that always seemed to creep in during these late-night patrols. The streets of downtown were unusually quiet, with only the occasional whoosh of passing cars breaking the silence. He took another sip of his now cold coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste as he turned onto Main Street. That's when he heard it. The unmistakable roar of a high-performance engine echoing off the glass and steel buildings. Raj straightened in his seat, suddenly wide awake. After 8 months on the force, he'd learned to recognize the different sounds of engines, from old pickup trucks to luxury sedans. But this was something special. The sound grew louder, and then he saw it. A neon green Lamborghini Huracan that looked like it had just rolled off a movie set. The street lights caught its angular edges, making it glow like some alien spacecraft that had landed in their quiet city. Raj couldn't help but let out a low whistle. In his entire time on the force, the most exotic thing he pulled over was his uncle's restored 1985 Corvette, and that had been during a family barbecue as a joke. As he watched, the supercar drifted slightly in its lane, corrected, then swayed again. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Raj's training had taught him to spot these subtle signs. He thought about his surgeon's words during training. Expensive cars don't make anyone above the law, rookie. His palms started to sweat a little as he gripped the steering wheel. A traffic stop like this could go sideways fast. Rich people could be unpredictable. Some would try to name-drop their way out of tickets. Others would threaten lawsuits before he could even say hello. Plus, there was always the chance this was some wannabe street racer looking to make a name for themselves. The Lamborghini drifted again, this time coming dangerously close to crossing the double yellow line. Raj took a deep breath, remembering his training. Just treat it like any other stop, he muttered to himself, though his racing heart suggested otherwise. He flicked on his patrol car's lights, half expecting the driver to hit the gas and take off. It wouldn't be the first time someone with a flashy car tried to outrun the law. To his surprise, the Lamborghini's brake lights came on immediately. The driver handled the pullover with unexpected smoothness, gliding into an empty parking lot like they were parking at a 5-star restaurant. Raj noticed how they chose a well-lit spot, positioned perfectly under a street lamp. That was unusual. Most people just pulled over wherever, often in the worst possible places. As he radioed in the stop to dispatch, Raj caught his reflection in his rearview mirror. His rookie nervousness was showing on his face, and he took a moment to compose himself. "You've done this 100 times," he reminded himself, adjusting his badge and checking his body camera was running. But as he stepped out of his patrol car, the gentle purr of that exotic engine and the way the Lamborghini seemed to glow under the streetlights reminded him that this stop was anything but ordinary. Little did he know, as he walked towards the driver's side window, that this seemingly routine traffic stop was about to become the most memorable moment of his young career, a story he'd be telling for years to come. The kind of story that would make veteran officers lean in closer at morning briefings, and one that would change how he viewed his role in the department forever. Standing there in the cool night air, with the city sleeping around him and his footsteps echoing off the empty buildings, Officer Raj Kumar was about to learn that sometimes the most important lessons in police work come when you least expect them, and from the most unlikely teachers. Officer Raj's heart thumped against his chest as he watched the neon green Lamborghini drift across the double yellow line. The moment stretched out like honey dripping from a spoon, that split second where every cop has to make a choice. His training surgeon's words echoed in his mind. Your gut will tell you when something's not right, but your head needs to make the final call. The empty streets seemed to hold their breath. Downtown's towering buildings loomed above, their windows dark except for the occasional office light, silent witnesses to what was about to unfold. The dashboard clock blinked 2:07 a.m., and Raj could feel each second tick by with crystal clarity. He'd seen this kind of weaving before. Sometimes it meant a tired driver heading home after a long shift. Other times, it was something more serious. The fact that this was a $300,000 supercar only made the decision more daunting. What if the driver was some hotshot lawyer? Or worse, what if it was someone connected to City Hall? His probation period wasn't even over yet. Raj adjusted his body camera and took a deep breath, catching a whiff of that night's coffee still lingering in his patrol car. Policy is policy, he whispered to himself, the words becoming a sort of prayer. His hand moved to the light bar controls almost on its own, muscle memory from countless traffic stops taking over. The moment he hit the lights, the night exploded into a dance of red and blue reflections, bouncing off the Lamborghini's glossy paint like fireworks. Raj held his breath, waiting for the driver's reaction. These were always unpredictable moments. He'd seen everything from panic to anger to attempted escape. But what happened next surprised him. The exotic car's brake lights illuminated smoothly, no sudden jerks or hesitation. The driver navigated into a nearby parking lot with a kind of precision that spoke of years behind the wheel. They chose a spot directly under a bright street lamp, positioned perfectly between the white lines. It was the kind of textbook traffic stop that instructors at the academy would use as an example. The engine's purr echoed off the surrounding buildings as the car settled into park. Raj couldn't help but admire how the Lamborghini looked under the streetlights, like some sort of spaceship that had touched down in their quiet city. Even stopped, it seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy. As he called in the stop to dispatch, giving his location and the vehicle description, Raj found himself running through his mental checklist. Check the trunk line for any signs it's been tampered with. Watch the side mirrors for passenger movement. Note all possible escape routes. Keep your distance until you've assessed the situation. His hand brushed against his holster, not out of fear, but as part of the ingrained routine that had been drilled into him during training. Unit 247, traffic stop, Main and 5th. Green Lamborghini Huracan. He spoke into his radio, proud that his voice didn't betray the butterflies in his stomach. The dispatch operator's response crackled back. Copy that. Unit 247. Standing by. Her familiar voice helped steady his nerves. She'd been working dispatch since before he joined the force, and her calm professionalism was legendary among rookies. Walking up to a car worth more than 10 years of his salary wasn't something they'd covered specifically at the academy. But then again, that was the thing about being a cop. You never really knew what each shift would bring. Some nights were all parking tickets and noise complaints, and others turned into the kind of stories that would follow you for your entire career. As Raj took those first steps toward the Lamborghini, his boots crunching softly on the asphalt, he had no idea that this stop was about to become one of those stories. The tinted windows revealed nothing of what awaited him, but something in his gut told him this wasn't going to be just another routine traffic stop. In his 8 months on the force, he'd learned to trust that feeling. It had rarely led him wrong. The walk from his patrol car to the Lamborghini felt like the longest 30 steps of Officer Raj's career. Each footfall echoed in the empty parking lot, mixing with the gentle idle of the exotic engine. The night air carried a crisp chill that helped keep his senses sharp, though his palms were starting to sweat inside his gloves. His flashlight beam danced across the car's surface, highlighting every perfect curve and angle of the neon green masterpiece. Up close, the Lamborghini was even more impressive and more intimidating. The door handle alone probably cost more than his first car. He could see his own reflection distorted in the mirror-like paint, his uniform looking almost out of place next to such luxury. Following his training, Raj approached from slightly behind the driver's side window, positioning himself to stay out of direct line of sight from the mirrors. The tinted windows were so dark they seemed to swallow his flashlight beam whole. He couldn't make out anything inside, not even a silhouette. That made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. In his 8 months on the force, he learned that not being able to see who you're dealing with was always cause for extra caution. Just another traffic stop, he mumbled to himself, though the rapid beating of his heart suggested otherwise. His free hand rested naturally near his belt as he reached the driver's window. The subtle vibration from the engine thrummed through the ground and into his boots. It was the kind of mechanical purr that made gearheads go weak at the knees. Raj tapped gently on the window with his flashlight. 2 quick, professional raps. The response was immediate. The window began to lower with an expensive-sounding hum, smooth as silk. The sound alone probably cost more than a month's rent. As the glass descended, the interior lights clicked on automatically, and Raj's world turned upside down. His flashlight beam crossed the car's interior, moving from the cream leather seats to the carbon fiber dashboard, and finally landed on the driver. The moment froze in time, like a photograph being burned into his memory forever. There, sitting behind the wheel of the Lamborghini, was Police Chief Mera, still wearing her formal uniform from earlier that evening. Raz's brain seemed to short-circuit. His mouth went dry, and he could swear his heart skipped at least 2 beats. The chief, his boss's boss's boss, was staring back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Was that embarrassment? Amusement? Annoyance? He'd only ever seen her at department meetings or passing through the hallways at headquarters, where she always carried herself with an air of unshakable authority. The light from his flashlight wavered slightly as his hand trembled. 8 months of training and experience seemed to evaporate in an instant. What was the protocol for pulling over your own police chief? That definitely hadn't been covered in the academy. He tried to remember if there was a chapter in the department manual about this situation, but his mind came up blank. The silence between them stretched out, broken only by the gentle purr of the Lamborghini's engine and the distant sound of a passing train somewhere in the city. The chief's badge caught the light from his flashlight, throwing a golden reflection onto the car's roof. Her 4 stars seemed to mock him, reminding him of just how far down the chain of command he really was. Through his earpiece, he could hear dispatch running the plate he called in earlier. Would they recognize it? Did anyone else know the chief was driving this car? The questions raced through his mind like a bullet train with no brakes. His mouth opened and closed once, but no words came out. In all his imagined scenarios about this traffic stop, angry businessman, wealthy teenager, even local celebrity, this possibility had never crossed his mind. Not even close. The neon green Lamborghini suddenly felt less like an exotic traffic stop and more like a cosmic joke the universe was playing on him. Time seemed to stand still in that parking lot as Officer Raj stood frozen beside the Lamborghini, his flashlight beam steady despite his internal turmoil. The silence between him and Chief Mera felt heavy enough to crush steel. Even the gentle purr of the exotic engine seemed to fade into the background, like the world was holding its breath. His mind raced through every training scenario he'd ever encountered, searching desperately for something, anything, that would tell him how to handle this situation. The chief sat there, still as a statue, her expression unreadable in the mix of street lamp glow and his flashlight beam. Her formal uniform looked impeccable even at this late hour, the gold stars on her collar catching the light like tiny beacons. Sweat began to form on Raj's forehead despite the cool night air. His throat felt as dry as sandpaper, and he could hear his own heartbeat drumming in his ears. The standard traffic stop script he used hundreds of times before seemed to have vanished from his memory, replaced by a jumble of conflicting thoughts. Should he apologize and walk away? No, that would go against everything he believed in as an officer. Should he proceed as if this was any other stop? But how could he pretend this was normal when his own chief was sitting there? The department manual had chapters on handling drunk drivers, aggressive suspects, and even diplomatic vehicles, but nothing about pulling over your own commanding officer. The radio in his ear crackled to life, making him jump slightly. Unit 247. Plate comes back registered to a Mr. Patel. The dispatcher's voice seemed impossibly loud in the quiet night. Raj noticed a slight change in the chief's expression at the mention of the name, Was that a hint of amusement in her eyes? His hand holding the flashlight began to tremble ever so slightly, casting dancing shadows across the Lamborghini's interior. He'd always prided himself on his steady hands during traffic stops, but this was different. This wasn't some random driver he'd never see again. This was the person who could make or break his career with a single word. Through the open window, he caught a whiff of what seemed to be fancy perfume mixing with the new car smell. The leather seats probably cost more than his entire wardrobe. The dashboard looked like something out of a spacecraft, with more buttons and screens than he could count. Everything about this scenario felt surreal, like he might wake up any moment in his patrol car, realizing it was all a dream. His mind drifted back to last week's department meeting, where Chief Mara had given a passionate speech about integrity and equal enforcement of the law. "We wear this badge to serve justice blindly," she had said, her voice firm and inspiring. "It doesn't matter if someone lives in a mansion or on the streets. The law applies to everyone equally." The irony of those words now felt like a weight on his chest. Movement in his peripheral vision snapped him back to reality. Another patrol car was slowing down as it passed the parking lot. Great, just what he needed, an audience. The other officer would surely recognize the chief's face, and by tomorrow morning, this story would be all over the department. He could already imagine the jokes in the break room, the sideways glances, the whispered conversations that would stop when he walked in. The chief shifted slightly in her seat, the leather creaking softly. Her right hand moved from the steering wheel to rest in her lap, and Raj instinctively tensed. Years of training kicking in before his brain could remind him that this wasn't a typical traffic stop. He noticed her department ID hanging from the rearview mirror, swaying slightly from the air conditioning. The photo showed her usual stern expression, so different from the enigmatic look she was giving him now. The whole situation felt like some sort of test, but he couldn't figure out if he was failing or passing. Every second that ticked by felt like an Officer Raj's mouth felt like he'd swallowed a desert as he finally managed to find his voice. "Good evening, ma'am. Chief." The words came out shakier than he'd hoped, hanging in the cool night air between them. His flashlight beam wobbled slightly, creating dancing shadows inside the Lamborghini's luxurious interior. The chief's response caught him completely off guard. Instead of the stern reprimand he was expecting, her face softened into what looked almost like a tired smile. "You know, Officer Kumar," she said, her voice carrying a hint of self-deprecation, "these Italian cars are nothing like my old Honda." She gestured at the spaceship-like dashboard with its bewildering array of buttons and screens. Raj blinked, his brain taking a moment to process this unexpected turn in the conversation. The chief continued, "I was trying to figure out how to adjust the radio when you spotted me." She shook her head, looking almost embarrassed. "My brother insisted I drive it home from the charity gala after my driver came down with something. I should have called for a replacement instead." The tension in Raj's shoulders eased slightly, but his training kept him alert. Even as his chief spoke, he couldn't help noticing small details, her clear eyes, steady hands, the formal attire from the gala she'd mentioned. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that made more sense than his initial fears. A passing truck's headlights swept across them, briefly illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. In that flash, Raj caught sight of something in the passenger seat. A fancy program booklet from what looked like the annual Police Benevolent Association dinner. He remembered seeing the announcements for it around the station. "I must have looked quite suspicious," the chief continued, a touch of humor entering her voice. "Weaving around at 2 a.m. in a bright green Lamborghini." She shifted in her seat, the leather creaking softly. "You know, most officers would have recognized my car and found an excuse to look the other way." Those words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Rad's grip tightened slightly on his flashlight as he processed what she was really saying. Was this a hint that he should have ignored the violation? Or was it something else? His mind raced through the implications. The radio in his ear crackled again with routine traffic from other units. A reminder that the rest of the city was still going about its business, unaware of this surreal encounter in a quiet parking lot. Someone was calling in a noise complaint across town. Another unit was finishing up a routine patrol. Normal night shift stuff that suddenly seemed a world away from this moment. "My brother's going to find this hilarious," the chief said, breaking into his thoughts. "He's always telling me I should learn to drive these things properly." She ran a hand over the steering wheel, the gold band of her ring catching the light. 30 years on the force, and I still prefer my old patrol car to these fancy machines." Something about the way she said it, the mention of her early days on patrol, made Raj relax slightly. For a moment, he could picture her as a rookie officer, probably facing the same kinds of situations he dealt with now. Before the gold stars, before the corner office at headquarters, she'd walked the same beat, made the same tough calls. The gentle purr of the Lamborghini's engine filled another moment of silence. A few blocks away, the city's nightlife was still in full swing. Music from a late-night venue drifted on the breeze, along with distant laughter and the usual urban symphony. But here in this parking lot, time seemed to move differently, like they were in a bubble where rank and protocol were suddenly up for renegotiation. "I suppose," the chief said, her tone becoming more official, "you'll want to see my license and registration." Her hand moved toward her purse, but her eyes stayed fixed on Raj's face, watching, evaluating. In that moment, he realized this conversation was about much more than a simple traffic stop. It was a test of character, of principles, of everything he'd sworn to uphold when he put on the badge. Officer Raj stood beside the gleaming Lamborghini, his mind racing faster than the supercar ever could. The weight of his badge felt heavier than usual against his chest as he faced what might be the most important decision of his young career. The chief's words about her struggle with the radio controls seemed reasonable enough, but his training nagged at him. Protocol was protocol, regardless of who sat behind the wheel. Time seemed to slow down as he mentally walked through his options. The weaving he'd observed was minor, probably exactly what you'd expect from someone wrestling with unfamiliar controls in a supercar. There were no signs of impairment. The chief's eyes were clear, her speech perfect, her movements precise. Yet something else bothered him, something that went beyond this single traffic stop. A cool breeze rustled through the parking lot, carrying with it the distant sounds of the city, sirens, music from late-night venues, the rumble. Before Officer Raj could make his decision, Chief Mehra did something that would be talked about in the department for years to come. Without being asked, she reached into her purse and pulled out her license and registration. The documents caught the beam of his flashlight as she held them out, her movement deliberate and precise. "I believe these are what you need, Officer Kumar," she said, her voice carrying a note of approval that made his heart skip a beat. "And I'd like you to run this stop exactly by the book." She straightened in her seat, looking every bit the chief even in this unusual situation. "Heaven knows I've given enough speeches about equal treatment under the law. Time to practice what I preach." Raj's hands were steady now as he accepted the documents. The tension in his shoulders began to ease, replaced by a growing sense of respect for his commanding officer. This wasn't just about a traffic stop anymore. It was about setting an example that would ripple through the entire department. He returned to his patrol car to run the license, following procedure to the letter. His radio crackled with routine traffic as he worked, but somehow the night felt different now. Through his windshield, he could see the chief waiting patiently in the Lamborghini, its neon green paint glowing under the street lamps like a beacon of unexpected integrity. When he returned to her window, she was smiling. Not the polite, official smile she wore at department meetings, but something more genuine. "You know," she said, glancing at the exotic dashboard, "when my brother lent me this car, I told him I'd probably end up making a fool of myself. Guess I was right." She chuckled softly. "But maybe some good will come of it." Raj found himself nodding as he completed his paperwork. The warning citation felt right. The weaving had been minor. explained by unfamiliarity with the vehicle rather than any serious violation. He explained each part of the warning clearly, just as he would for any other driver. "I appreciate your professionalism, Officer Kumar," the chief said as she accepted the citation. "It's easy to talk about integrity in morning briefings. It's harder to show it at 2 in the morning when nobody's watching." She paused, considering her next words carefully. "Or when everybody's watching, which is what you'll be dealing with tomorrow." She was right. By morning, this story would be all over the department. But somehow, that didn't bother him anymore. His father's words about justice never sleeping made more sense now than ever before. 2 weeks later, Raj found himself standing in the department's training room, facing a fresh batch of recruits. The chief had asked him to share this story as part of their ethics training. As he looked at their eager faces, he realized that what had started as a nerve-wracking traffic stop had become something more, a living lesson in what it meant to wear the badge. The story took on a life of its own within the department. Officers would retell it during late-night shifts, each version slightly different, but the core message always the same. Rank doesn't place anyone above the law, and true leadership means being accountable to the same standards you enforce. As for the chief, she went back to driving her reliable Honda the very next day. But something had changed in how officers viewed her. She wasn't just their commander anymore. She was someone who lived the principles she taught. The neon green Lamborghini had long since been returned to her brother, but its impact on the department's culture would last far longer than its tire marks on the city streets. Years later, when newer officers would ask Raj about that night, he'd tell them it wasn't really about the traffic stop at all. It was about those moments in your career when you have to decide who you're going to be, not just as an officer, but as a person. Sometimes those moments come roaring up to you in a bright green Lamborghini, and sometimes they slip in quietly during a routine patrol. But they always come, and how you handle them shapes not just your own future, but the future of everyone who follows in your footsteps.